Recording. Go for it.
All right. Welcome everyone to this POC meeting. We haven't had one in a while. We had a special request to continue discussions around the F5 Engine X use case proposal. So with that, I'd like to ask where you would like to go first, Tim.
Oh, I mean, what I want, like if I'm being completely greedy, is some understanding for what PaaS layer we're building on top of. I don't think it really is a blocker in the short term. We're going to make containers, but those containers need to talk to each other. And if there's some sort of agreement on PaaS layer, then I can make sure that whatever configuration they come with by default will work on that PaaS layer. Also, I'll just, build one of them.
Is everybody in the room familiar with Tim's proposal?
No.
No. Okay. Do you guys want us to walk through it?
Please.
Great. I will share my screen. Tim, are you brain ready for this?
I am always brain ready for this.
Awesome. Then I will share my desktop and we will get this moving.
It has the advantage of being more or less the same thing we were talking about almost a year ago at this point.
Yeah. Hold on 1 second. Bear with me, guys, while I set up my presentation real quick. And it may shift around a little bit. So Tim built this. I did not, but essentially the content that, and I'm going to hand it off to him in a second. Essentially, the goal is to have Nginx open source function as our first workload. But Tim, you dive in and tell us what you've been thinking about.
Right. So essentially, like here at F5, we do a lot of hardware acceleration, and we have a lot of practice, sort of testing hardware acceleration and evaluating it. But unfortunately, we do that with a lot of closed source workloads that we've sort of assumed aren't super interesting to OPI. So we've been trying to think about so what can we give to OPI that will let us benchmark hardware acceleration, but also test hardware acceleration in a way that we can pivot our applications to? Because just to let you know, we do a lot of hardware acceleration, but we're very, very happy to have our software accelerate more hardware than we're able to code drivers for. Right? Like there's a certain amount of effort that goes into that. So OPI is, looking interesting to us. And so we were kind of thinking about what is effectively the simplest possible workload that we could possibly deliver to OPI to get the ball rolling and to start things. There's a lot more complicated thoughts that we have in terms of, how would we test ECMP and stuff, things we're not going to do with Nginx. But to start with, we need to be able to, deploy workloads. We need to be able to, test workloads, and ideally do so in a fashion which is every partner of OPI is able to participate in and verify, right? There's this whole question about, if somebody says they've done something, that's great. They propose a pull request for some code. How would we verify that it, it does what they think it does? And, why are we picking Nginx? Well, I mean, for one thing, a lot of times when we have private conversations with hardware vendors, they sometimes already have Nginx accelerated. It's a very common thing for them to work on. Obviously, it works on ARM processors, which is great because a lot of the DPUs that are being proposed use ARM processors. And as we said, the closed source workloads that we normally would use for this just aren't useful. So the workload that we're proposing, we have working, have had working for years inside of F5, but of course it's entirely leveraging closed source software that's, not super interesting. So let's take a slide forward to talk very specifically about what we mean by a workload here. So yes, was there a question? Okay. So what we're talking about are 3 pods, a traffic source, an application, and a traffic target pod. And the idea is that this gives us the ability to measure and compare hardware acceleration features. And they can be deployed in a number of different configurations. So if we're in a sort of an inbound role where the traffic would be hitting a DPU, running the workload, and
From
then
from the network.
Yeah, from the network, and then forwarding that traffic across the PCI bus to the host. That would be like classic firewall example, TLS offloads, all sorts of good stuff. And then for switching, load balancing, and ECMP, then the traffic would actually originate from the host. It would go to the DPU, and then from the DPU, it would go out onto the network. Also, to be clear, we do a lot of hairpinning in our internal tests. That's where the traffic source is on the host, the application's on the DPU, but then the traffic target is also on the host. This lets you do a lot of high-speed network testing without needing expensive optics or switching gear. We have those. We have facilities that can generate terabit traffic flows and all the like, but they're limited resources. And if you have a bunch of devs working on something, you need something simpler for them to be able to test locally. And so they can.
But it's also a real use case, for example, for Red Hat here on the call, like pod-to-pocket communication through the DPU. So hairpinning from host to the DPU back to host for network offloading. I think it's a real use case.
Yeah, exactly. And so the idea is that the pods, you can put them wherever you want to figure out, depending upon what use case you're testing. Also, there's, source to DPU to host to DPU to target. That's a valid traffic use case, but what we're delivering is not going to out of the box be able to do that, since it's a little more complicated. We want to start with something nice and simple. And so we just wanted to mention that we're delivering 3 pods so that we can move them to different locations to test different use cases. Moving forward a slide. And this is kind of like, there's a bunch of different pieces of this proposal. One is to say that the deliverables for workloads are defined as a set of 3 things: a source, a workload, and a target. And that we want to use containers because operating system compatibility matrices make me sad. And I have spent exactly as many hours of my life as I want to explain to someone why my stuff doesn't work on Solaris. And then we want to use, PaaS or Kubernetes or something so that we don't have to deal with network configuration issues. In other words, so that we can deliver these containers, and it's up to, the person doing the deployment to figure out the networking versus us having to include it in, configuration information or whatever.
So Tim, maybe I'm jumping 2 slides forward by asking this question. So this is all excellent and very clear for me, but from the practical perspective, is just deploying a simple container of Nginx inside the DPU, having the traffic generator container deployed as well, having the target on the host as well. So you have 3 containers communicating with each other, either layer 2, layer 3, whatever we decide, with TLS, for example, and stuff. So what is the actual proposal here, except for that? Because running 3 containers is not a challenge.
The container is, the challenge is that we're going to then want to integrate with whatever the deployment system is that's being proposed by OPI, right? The zero trust model or whatever it is, so that we can deploy this. And then there's going to be configuration. So we talked about source, workload, and target. Well, there's going to be a bunch of different workloads, right? We're going to be testing different hardware acceleration features, and that'll require configuration. So that lets us start having the conversation about, great, how do we get configuration information to the container?
So
right?
How are we configuring the Nginx server itself?
Well, yes, technically that's physically true, but in practice, it's a container. How do I get configuration information into that container? And then the system, whatever system deployed the container, like, how did it know which container to deploy? Right.
So on deployment, on deployment, we just started the conversations. We don't have a way to do it. So that's probably
right. So the idea is that this would give us something to deploy, right? Yeah. So it's not intended to sit around and wait for that conversation, but if we have a thing to deploy, then we have something that we can actually test deployment code against.
But we don't have a deployment code.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, okay.
That's
this is part of the proposal.
That's why we're coming to the POC.
The motivation. Well, yeah, Boris, this gives us the motivation to develop that code now with an actual Nginx target for that code. In other words,
yeah, absolutely. I'm just asking, like, if this is, relies on that, or this is something part of the contribution.
No. We're not gonna block this. We think that having this would make it easier to start and have the conversation about deployment, because it gives us something we can compare against.
And this is not something that you want to actually contribute as well, right? as part of F5 contribution of this?
No, we want to assign F5 resources to deliver the workload, and then we'll participate in the conversation about deployment.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks
Yeah,
for
so,
clarification.
yeah, so if you separate the two, Boris,
Mhm.
Tim's proposal is to bring the application, right? That's what F5 is going to contribute. And then we want to collaborate with people in this group or other groups to basically stand up the POC. And the POC is, hey, let's provision and establish a PaaS layer on a card. Then let's deploy this application on that card. And then let's configure that application for its networking and other needs, right? That's the POC.
Then
Yeah.
let's
whole
actually
thing.
engage real hardware acceleration from
Yes.
the card.
And then we can show that to Verizon, Comcast, and others and say, hey, look, here's OPI doing a real end-to-end application.
Yeah, I'm just trying to break it down into pieces. Yeah, thank
Yes.
you.
So what
That
F5
helps a
is
lot.
bringing is not the whole solution. We're just bringing the application that needs to be part of that solution.
Hey, Venkat's got his hand up. So Venkat, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm just trying to also understand, like Boris, right? So this still keeps our networking model discussion that we are having in the API group alive. I think we need to solve that. That solves the lower layer. And then, of course, this will give in my view, like an execution environment, right? We are trying to move towards a platform. We're not quite standardizing, but we need to have Nginx, which is actually is the most widely deployed out there, would help us, encourage anyone who has application to, really sit on top of that, right?
Yep.
Is my understanding.
Exactly.
So the contribution is, I understand now. So we have the first part is how we deploy the containers, which we need to figure out. And then the container itself, that is contribution, which is, open source Nginx container that we just deploy, which is very simple. The third part is the configuration of the Nginx, whether we need to do networking API, firewall API, new gRPC service, how we actually configure the containers that running on the DPU.
Yep.
And the last piece is the probably source generation, which is, kind of iPerf application that can drive traffic too.
Yeah.
And that's part of the F5 contribution, is that source and target containers.
Yeah.
It can generate the traffic and validate it.
Excellent. Okay, that helps. Maybe, if you can extend this presentation with that specific things, it will help. Okay, thanks.
Right. And this is where we were talking about how we're only talking about delivering the software. And the idea is these containers, you can run them anywhere. You don't technically need a DPU at this point. It's just intended to start conversations about, hardware acceleration, application installation, application configuration, networking, all that good stuff. And we're not proposing to manage or automate some sort of PaaS layer installation, in part because we haven't even picked a PaaS layer at this point, right? That would be getting ahead of ourselves. So it's as Boris said, it's a very simple thing that is being proposed, but at the same time, getting this group to agree on what a workload delivery looks like is still an accomplishment, right? Getting us all to say, hey, this is an okay thing for an app. If an application group wants to propose an application to test within OPI, this is what that might look like. So
again, I'm not saying good or bad. I'm just, trying to wrap my head around this. So let me just a little bit challenge it. I'm not saying that it's a good or bad. So we have today deployed the POC with IPsec offloading using strong swan container. So what we do today, and I'm just trying to see whether this is exactly the same work that we did just with Nginx. So we have strong swan container, exactly like you have with Nginx, that running inside the DPU. We have the source and target applications that running traffic through that strong swan application. The strong swan itself already uses the hardware acceleration for IPsec offload. So I'm just wondering if this is exactly the same. Just, instead of strong swan for IPsec with hardware acceleration, we're doing Nginx with TLS offload for them.
Yeah, it sounds very similar.
Yeah, it looks exactly the same. And we already have that deployed. We have POC, we have end-to-end CI/CD pipelines. clients and targets already
What is
configured.
Strong I'm sorry.
Strong Swan.
SWAN.
Strong
Strong
Swan.
Swan is the key manager, the key manager for most. Yeah,
Is it an open source key manager?
I can send you. So once we have that, we have already deployed it in DPUs and GPUs, both
so
software
Boris,
solution and hardware.
What was the PaaS layer for deploying that POC?
We use Docker Compose. We didn't choose PaaS layer, exactly like the question the team is asking. What is a PaaS layer? So we decided to do it with native containers, run C and containerd, using Podman and Docker Compose. And we didn't want to start a discussion on the PaaS layer, but yeah, we can definitely take that and expand it to how we deploy it. What is a PaaS layer? And one piece that is not clear for me yet, but we did solve it for IPsec Strong Swan, is we did implement the entire management already using gRPC protobufs to Strong Swan applications. So we can actually expose gRPC endpoint and we send all the gRPC commands to Strong Swan to actually configure the tunnels. So we do all the IPsec work already comprehends the configuration part as well, which is not clear for me how we do that with Nginx yet.
So, right. So the question, Boris, is that the general framework for configuring applications running on the DPUs, that gRPC sort of translator into the local application, API that already exists, wrap it with gRPC, expose it through the gRPC MUX we have, so you have a single IP to talk to, IP address to talk to. Is that the general proposal?
Yeah, again, we're running the gRPC load balancer, and top of that, that exposes a single endpoint. We have the router redirect, but for specifically Strong Swan and Nginx or F5, we need to come up with a standard management method like we did with IPsec. We can do that with Nginx. We can do it with F5.
So,
we can do it.
Yeah. So the question is that the right approach for in general? Is that the right approach across the board for all of these class of applications? Because if it works for Strong Swan, I don't see why it wouldn't work for Nginx from what I know about Nginx. And therefore, is there any, should we push for that direction and see if that's the general answer? Since again, as you say, you already did it for Strong Swan.
What are the limits of that gRPC?
Well, yeah, that's sort of what I'm asking.
The application is going to bring its own network identity, and it's going to have its own UX, and it's going to talk on the network, and it's going to be able to do its own things. Where it needs is its initial launch configuration, right? That has to be outside of the application.
Yes and no. Like we do with storage APIs and networking APIs, we do the same with IPsec APIs. We expose the gRPC endpoint, so at any point in time, the customer can send the gRPC APIs, whether the customer is cloud providers that has external controller that sends the gRPC APIs, or it's an application that is running locally, it doesn't really matter, but it can abstract and send exactly the same gRPC APIs to any application in the same domain, any implementation of the same application, regardless of what hardware that you're actually using.
This, John, I haven't really talked before. I was one of the authors for the open offload stuff, and we use gRPC to SmartNICs. So just our perspective was it works very well, and it's open standard, so it's easy. Anybody can use it. You can publish a proto file, and then any language you can generate any language for it. So
this is exactly what we do. Yeah,
there's a lot of advantages. The bigger challenge I think we see is the communication channel, whether you want to control the SmartNIC or DPU from its management port or through an interface like TMF-IO they use on NVIDIA through the VF from the host to the
But I don't want either of those. I want to control it from the application on the DPU.
Well, yes, but the question Tim,
locally is always an option. Yeah,
maybe options, because there is some good security control if you don't have the application talk to the DPU directly through management. If you have a separate management But that's
Why wouldn't we
that's
why
discussion.
wouldn't we all possibly offer more than one solution? It seems like there's. some tension.
I completely agree, Laura.
Yeah.
I'm not proposing multiple solutions, but I'm saying there's pros and
Right.
cons of both that I think it's worthwhile having a discussion
Mhm.
about, because
Yep.
there's definite security advantages not having the host directly access the DPU from the host, but actually going through
So,
a management network.
it's a good question, John, and we have several discussions already on
Okay,
this. So once we
I'll
expose the gRPC API,
yes,
we
to that end.
also deploy the authorization authentication service. And then you can decide whether you expose that RPC only to the network, only to the local application on the DPU, like Tim is saying, or to the host, because we still see a lot of applications on the host that do want to configure the DPUs locally, not using TMF for proprietary NVIDIA Bluefield APIs, but we do see almost all the vendors produce some kind of NetDev that is dedicated for management. So we do follow that as well. So yeah, go ahead.
If I'm deploying an application that does something that no other application has done before, the model here would be that I would go to OPI and work out what the protobuf for that capability would look like. Is that what we're thinking?
Two options, as I see. If we have something in common, for example, networking APIs, how we configure IP addresses, or for firewall, like how you do ACLs, for example, right? Rules and stuff like that, that can be common. Then it makes sense to make it an OPI, shared across all the vendors, so you can configure those things in a standard way. All of us are believing that there are proprietary stuff, so we already envisioned and we already provisioned for that in protobuf extensions. So every vendor can create an protobuf extensions or vendor partner, don't really matter. For those, keep them either privately or publish them separately. If they wanted to do it through API, they can. If they want to do it separately, they can. But this is basically extension, which is added value of this company to the existing common layer. And if you see 2-3 companies that come up with probably the same protobuf extensions, we can then pull them into the common protobuf definitions, and then we have a little bit larger and larger common base as we go and as we grow, versus completely derailing it. But it's all open at this point.
Is this
Yeah, I completely agree with
process
Boris, yeah.
documented anywhere?
Yes.
Excellent.
The protobuf extensions are documented in API repository. I can find the links.
And we've seen this happen we developed the offload one, then VMware came along and extended it with another set of extensions for IPsec and tunnels. It's more like Boris said, they've created something in parallel and it's being merged back in again. But it's because it's all protobufs, it's easy to extend, and the way the protobuf versioning works, if all you do is add features, the old stuff still works. So
Yep.
it's a nice way of creating new things without breaking old things.
Exactly. And I posted a few links for API extension that we were thinking about. I'm not saying that we need to create for F5 specifically. If we're talking about F5, I don't know what is the right approach. Whether you already have your APIs, you just expose them, and then customer can configure the firewall, or we have some kind of common ground across different firewall vendors that we want to make common. I have absolutely no idea. I do know that for networking, storage, and IPsec specifically, we did came up with a single proposal. Of networking is a little bit tricky, but for rest of stuff, there is a common proposal that everybody can agree upon on a standardization. I'm just trying to figure out how Nginx helps us in addition to the.
Well, I guess what I'm trying to understand is why the TSC is more interested in this than your proposal, Boris.
I think it wasn't communicated well from my perspective. It's my fault, I think, maybe. But again, I don't mind taking exactly the same model and replicate it to Nginx. Absolutely, this is absolutely valid use case. I'm just saying this is 5 minutes work, copy paste of what we did, and replace the image names with Nginx.
So Boris, if it's that easy, then it's pure win. We just won.
Right.
And the reason we won is because we can say, look how easy it is to integrate another application. all you do is the following steps, follow this recipe, and now it's easy to deploy on the DPU. You can do all the things. Look, here's another example of hooking it up. We can go back through the IPsec strong swan example for everyone and explain why the Google protocol bus are the way they are and what that gives you, and say, look, we can make Nginx work.
That's true, but Tim raised a very good questions. How we actually deploy the applications?
Right.
We never touched it, and this is a good opportunity. I agree with you to refresh that and maybe try to resolve it. How we configure the Nginx? We never discussed it. So yeah.
Exactly. So John, John McDowell, do you have the trade-offs from before that you can share when you did similar work before? Can you share that? Do you have a written form of it?
The stuff on the GitHub we put in documentation. I'm happy to willing to share our experiences. I mean, we've done some internal development to port the stuff to 3-4 different DPU vendors already with minimal changes. So
Which DPUs did you guys use?
because they're not public, I can't mention them.
Hmm.
We've done NVIDIA, obviously. That's something we've announced. But there's not many DPU vendors out there, so you could probably guess the rest.
Right.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that we're sort of trying to determine when we have a conversation about having ported to DPUs is what people have access to, because access is an interesting conversation right now.
Yeah, so we've got most of them in the lab, so that's not a. It's so.
And what you deploying, John? Just
sorry, say again.
When you did with the DPUs, what is it actual app? What you actually
the app is the offload stuff that Kyle ported over.
Session offload.
Yeah, session
offload and session offload. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And then one other just sort of question that I have is around, so you have these gRPC, APIs, sort of what is envisioned as calling them? Because if we were to take, for example, Kubernetes, right? The Kubernetes master is effectively what would be calling them, because you'd have some sort of Helm chart or whatever, and that would give the Kubernetes master some idea of what it wants to run where. And then the actual deployment and configuration of the individual nodes becomes something that the master would handle.
You hit in very good point. We have API workstream. Let me share the link for the presentation that Billy here on the call did. The proposal is I think pretty clear, so you can see in the presentation what we're trying to do. It's not exactly the Kubernetes master that's sending all of that. So we have kubeproxy, we have network policy. So there is a proposal to integrate, and how we integrate with those CNI and policy providers. So I just suggest you to catch up a little bit on these two presentations, and then we can have a follow-up discussion. Just to not to reiterate.
It also depends on application. I mean, if you're thinking of doing so for the offload stuff we do, that would be done on one of our DP containers. So kubeproxy or API server would not see it. The same if we were trying to do IPsec offload or some of that stuff, we would probably, in that case, API server might see it. So I think it depends is a good way of thinking about it, is what the use case is and what the offloads are.
So I guess the question, Boris, to amplify what Tim, I don't know, we have two Tims, right? What Tim was saying is do those proposals in the API group cover the general case for application access setup? In other words, for this Nginx, we want to be able to specify what goes from the two containers, say on the host, or one local host container, one remote host container, through the Nginx. You need to be able to set up the networking and the traffic flow so that the packets actually go to that intermediate Nginx. It's like a service chain almost, or a network function virtualization. And can we build a general way to do that for all applications? I think that's the question Tim was driving at. Did I misunderstand, Tim?
I mean, that's part of it. Or another way is what is the expected way to accomplish all of those things? It doesn't have to be general. Some of it can be a mix of general and specific. It can depend, as I think someone said, it depends. I just want to understand what that proposal is, and then go through it myself so that I'm in a position to have, sort of a clearer understanding of what is being proposed, and, provide any feedback we might have from having gone through that process.
So first, we can break it into a few pieces. First piece is how we push containers into DPU. We haven't started this conversation, or barely started this conversation in the lifecycle provisioning group. So I want to talk to Billy, I want to talk to Steven, I want to talk to all of and team, all of you guys, how we push containers. Can we standardize on OCI interface, or we have to assume some kind of a PaaS, Kubernetes distribution at some point, or we can do just a standard CRI abstraction layer for the containers? I don't know. Can we use Podman and the Podman's specific implementation, remote management? This is a very good conversation that we need to have, and we didn't have it yet. So this is a first gap for me, how we actually push containers. Download images, start containers, lifecycle them, all of that. Obviously, Kubernetes helps a lot, but we cannot assume that everybody can run Kubernetes inside the DPUs. The second question is, well, you deployed your pod initially, or container. How you actually configure all the things you need to configure. I guess for F5, you already have your kind of REST API, let's say, for the sake of the argument, how you can configure your firewall. Would you be willing to create a common abstraction APIs across different firewall vendors? How you approach rules and stuff like that. So we can take F5, we can take Palo Alto, we can take any implementation we have for firewall specifically and abstract that. I don't know if you want. Maybe yes, maybe no. Can we identify only ACLs, for example?
Well, so there's another way to break that piece down, Boris, which is to say, what is common across all of them that would be useful to have a common API for? And then you basically say, hey, everything else that isn't specified here is application specific. That's another way to break it down, is to the common and the specific part, and you deliberately leave the specific parts as separate exercise or a direct exercise. All right, keep going. What's number 3?
Yeah, I think that's it.
No, you said there were 4. Push containers, configure the deployed container, and then what were the other 2?
Yeah, and dependency, right? So for example, firewall, in order to start running, you need first to configure all the networking. So we definitely can reuse all the work that we're doing in the networking, whether it's Kubernetes or just, controller-based gRPC, like
Right,
Cloud API proposal.
but the difference is now the application's configuring the network.
It's not important, because once we expose the gRPC endpoint, the application itself can use and do locally, localhost, and configure all of these networking.
Because Nginx is a proxy and a firewall, I mean, not a firewall, a load balancer, it's all about the network.
Yeah, I agree. But
Much
once
more
we
so
have the
than- much more
networking
so-
APIs,
Much
Yeah,
more
go
so than your strong swan use case.
yeah,
Which makes it a good example for extending the deployment model on the DPU, and really the connection configuration, or I don't know, service chain or whatever, because that's really what it is. I mean,
Yeah, and the networking stuff we developed when it came out of the cloud use case, it doesn't look to me like it's directly usable by an on DPU application the way we want to use it in Nginx. Maybe it can be used that way.
why is that? Go through that again, state that again, but just use more words.
Because it has all these presumptions about the overlay and the underlay and who's establishing them and why they're being established. And they're all very focused on this external controller. Right.
Some yes and some no. I
That's a
agree.
master view.
Yeah, keep going, Tim.
an external controller that has a master view, right, and is pushing these configs. And a lot of it's wrapped around the host and the relationship of what's on the host to what's on the DPU. And my Nginx instance running on the DPU could give a crap about the host or its networking, right? It's managing its own presence on the external network and what it's doing for traffic coming across that network.
Yeah, but you need some of it. You need, for example, if you have OVS.
I'm saying maybe we can pick through it and find it, right?
Yeah.
But the way it's been structured and named, it's very much built around the presumption of the cloud use case of a hyperscaler.
I agree.
So I think enumerating that, Tim, would be useful for sort of teasing out the stuff Boris was driving at.
Yeah, and I think that's what we'll start to dive into once we have the application.
Okay.
And then I'll work with Tim Worsley and we'll try to figure out, can we use what's there or do we need to propose something different?
And so for server service function chaining, 2 weeks ago, we have done a proposal also to manage service function chaining with young models and to chain function, because it will never be only one use case. Perhaps we can do step by step or do not. It's more midterm solving this service function chaining. But yeah, people want multiple function, and it could be a firewall plus load balancer, and we need to connect both. And just to go back to Nginx, also compared to the list of use cases of a use case group, Nginx is also not, it's like OVN was not really a use case. Nginx is not also a use case. Are we more speaking of firewall use case, load balancing, which function we should provide as a use case with Nginx?
So my opinion is we shouldn't be restricted by the use case group. That's not important. My second opinion is that it's both. It's both the firewall function and the load balancing function have value at a DPU. Anybody disagree?
I
Sorry,
don't
can you repeat the
disagree. I think the
question?
question is, which one are we implementing first, or are we doing both together?
Well, I think we have to determine if there's some, well, sorry.
Or doing
Go
nothing.
ahead, Lauren. Finish your thoughts.
I think there's a question about appeal and usability, right? That we probably need to take into consideration. And also whether the use cases are, how similar the use cases are, if there's some discrepancies between the two that make them both valuable. Because they may both have value that we can leverage. And I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater with either of them. Because if you have viability in each space, and it seems like there's different networking discrepancies between the two, you could possibly leverage each solution or possibly use both solutions in partnership. And I think that's the real value of this conversation that we need to consider. And that's
look at it.
There's a group.
I would look at it from two angles. One is we're trying to show it's easy to build and deploy applications on a DPU, and you have a infrastructure for it. Then the second thing I think is really important is showing the value of the DPU, i.e., why would I ever use a DPU? There has to be some way we demonstrate that the DPU delivers unique value.
I think you
Otherwise,
just hit the nail on the head, John. That's a really impressive point.
I just don't understand what Nginx gives us in addition to a strong one. We can take that already existing application and solve all the
I don't
use
know
cases.
that it has to be- I don't think that it has to be a fight.
I'm trying to understand. Yeah.
The user community would love to have an Nginx in a repo on OPI that they could pull down and deploy on a DPU today. That would draw tremendous attention to OPI and what we're doing. Strong Swan is not generating that kind of traction right now.
And also, it's really
Nginx doing
simple.
what? Docker run, and you have your Nginx on the
And nobody
DPU.
wants to deploy it that way. It needs to be
rest
on,
window dressing.
yeah, it needs to be on OpenShift or something, right?
Yeah, it needs
We
to
are not there, and we will not be there. I think, if you ask me, never.
Why not?
Because it's not open source community job to package things and deploy them in a production matter for customers. It's the individual companies that make money out of that thing. What we can do for them is we can develop a bunch of source code, And if you worked in open source, you understand that everybody works like that. Nobody is taking Kubernetes upstream and deploying that in production. Nobody is taking SPDK or DPDK and deploying that in production. So it doesn't make sense to me to package anything. I don't believe OPI should go into that space at all.
But I don't think it's strictly a packaging exercise. It's a, do we have all of the pieces we need so that somebody could package and sell it? I mean, SPDK and you know, DPDK both have that, right? They have all the pieces they need, and they can tell you how to hook it up completely so that you can build your application around that, or your deployment around that, your solution around that, and use it. I mean, they don't give you a turnkey, yes, we support, and you know, we quote.
But yes, look at what we have, what we implemented. None of it is in that area. And we even haven't started discussion. What we can do today: zero-touch provisioning, monitoring with OpenTelemetry, Docker run and Docker Compose run of containers. This is not anything that Tim, if I understand you, Tim, correctly, this is not what you're looking for. We don't know how to deploy containers into DPU in a at scale.
Right.
We never talked about it. We don't know how to configure networking.
Have we provided all the pieces so that somebody can do what you're talking about? And if we have, let's demonstrate that in one example, right? Where we pull the whole thing together. Now it's a POC, it's not a supported thing. You can't come back to us with bugs. If you download it and try to use it, that's on you, but we're at least going to demonstrate it working at some level and having it being a complete solution, right?
I understand, but POC cannot happen before we close on the specification. How can we push containers? This should be a spec.
Sure, but we can use the Nginx to.
But we already have StrongSwan. What is the difference? What application? Why are we onboarding another Nginx that somebody needs to support?
I think that if you leverage multiple solutions, you provide more viability to your product. I think there's nothing wrong with being right in the first place. And there's nothing wrong with being right in the second place. I think you can have more than one argument here for us.
If it's that easy, let's demonstrate that, and you know, clearly demonstrate that, and then again, if it's that easy, let's show it. Say, look how easy it was to do Nginx on here. You can follow this same procedure, and you get all these other tools from OPI, and here's the right way to integrate. And now go to town. Lots of applications can come in, and you know, people can be productive. What am I missing from that?
You're missing that we have no tooling. We have POC repository that has Docker Compose file that can spin a bunch of containers. It will take me 2 minutes to add Nginx with Hyperf load balancer, with a load generator into that. 5 minutes, I promise you. And we have zero tooling how to deploy on DPUs.
So then we highlight that we need to build that tooling and focus on that. That seems reasonable.
But if this, we have limited amount of resources, Joe. You need to prioritize what we're working on. Are we closing network APIs? Are we doing Kubernetes integration with OpenShift proposal from Red Hat? Are we doing zero-touch provisioning? Are we doing monitoring and telemetry? We need to focus on something. We cannot just keep adding new topics and hope that people will jump in and do that. We're already very thinly spread. SPDK, storage, IPsec, there's all working streams that consume a lot of time. So if we want to create tooling, first we need to agree. I completely disagree that we need to create tooling, but I'm not on TSC board, so I'm not deciding these things. But if we as a community decide that tooling is something that we need, absolutely, let's decide and let's do it.
So Boris, if F5 brings this Nginx application, will you spend the 5 minutes to do your deployment and show us how it's going to work on a real DPU?
Yeah, absolutely, no problem. I don't need F5. I know how to pull Nginx image in the Docker Compose and run the workload generator in POC. But yeah, for sure, I'm happy to work with you always. I'm just trying to see if I'm missing something. I'm not negative. I'm just asking annoying questions. I'm sorry about that, but trying to understand what am I missing.
So what if we worded it a different way? So for your IPsec, you've got a set of protobufs to set that up, right?
To configure the tunnel, yeah.
Yeah.
We assume that a strong swan already running on the DPUs, whether with Docker Compose or Kubernetes Helm charts or whatever. And then we have a bunch of protobufs that can configure the strong swan application to actually establish the tunnel.
But now using the Nginx, wouldn't that help us expand the networking APIs and how to provision the load balancer and firewall? Give us a real live example of how to provision that. You by defining protobufs to do that.
Yes, but for what use case? Cloud with centralized controller or Kubernetes like you proposed with kubeproxy and policy?
I mean, we attack it from both ways and see where they're common. I mean, I want to take it from a Kubernetes point of view. I think, you know, Vipin was tackling it from the cloud perspective. So if we had it from both ways, and you could then see what's in common and how they differ. And then
let's say we did that. So now we have a new protobuf, which is for Nginx, right? So now
no, it's for, well, I mean, in general, it'd be for a firewall or load balancer. But yes, we would use Nginx as an example.
Yeah, and then comes F5 and say, guys, I don't care about what you did because I already have REST APIs. This is what I want to use. So everything that we did before that is what? Throwing away?
I think we should not create an extra story there. I think we should allow for us to see what happens with the use cases that you both just elucidated.
If we can find the common grounds, like, I don't know, I'm not an expert, but ACLs, for example, right? The common way how we can push ACLs and we define protobuf for that everybody can use that, for sure, absolutely. But if we cannot find the common ground, I'm just wondering why we're defining the new protobus for Nginx that cannot be reused by F5, Palo Alto, and others. We just need experts from firewall company to come and say, yeah, we need these APIs and we can produce these APIs, and those are common across the industry. I'm not a firewall expert.
It's more the plumbing of this application that is key to have first enabled, because like redefining how you build a firewall, I don't think you can. You will always reduce what's the common denominator of all of these things. And I think with things presented with open config or young models, you let to the application vendor the effort to define the specific function, but redefining what is a firewall, perhaps it's like an unlimited work on the. I don't know if it's doable. Yeah. And for every new type of application, you have to redefine what is this. What is a firewall? What is a load balancer? But at least for the Kubernetes, what we have proposed, yeah, we are interested to have this Nginx application. Also we can help to try to link with a Kubernetes, because the more we add a use case on the application, the more we can test the architecture on the proposal for OPI API.
Are we ready, everyone? I think that with Billy.
No, we are not ready. We are not ready, but we have some proposals here.
Yeah, in the first draft, we don't really understand the shim CNI. We don't really understand the proxy, kubeproxy. We have disagreement between Red Hat and HP on the approach. We're very early.
I'm curious as to why we are so resistant to possibly building it and seeing what the outcome is. It seems interesting to me, since we've already built one possible solution. What would be the issue with actually building a second one and seeing what the response was? It seems strange to me that we wouldn't, as engineers, want to pursue something that could possibly get us to the next place.
If it's the next place, I'm all for it. But
Yeah, but
again,
you don't know until you try, right? You don't know until you find out how we play in that use case space. And I think saying that we can't do it because there could be a problem would mean that we never built anything regardless of what industry we were in.
So Boris, a lot of the complexity around the Kubernetes conversation has been about offloading the CNI from the host. What we're talking about here has nothing to do with the host, right? The kubelet and everything is on the DPU. So there's not much to fight about, I don't think.
But
It's
then
not
what
something-
value? Yeah, I understand. But then what value API brings to you? You have REST API for F5 that you will configure your firewalls, for example, from some remote
Yeah.
location, centralized manager.
I guess we'll come back to Joe's comments that if we do it and it's easy, then we should advertise that. And if we do it and we find problems, then we've exposed that we haven't solved everything.
Yeah, so I think we could take this, we're basically out of time. I think we could take this up. So there's a general discussion here about application POC into OPI that probably should be had at the TSC level. I mean, I think this is a good discussion for the TSC and gets to something useful. Do we want to do this engine exercise as an exercise and see where it takes us, to Laura's point? Or is it sort of not going to really get us anything in the end, to some of the points Boris made? And he's bringing this up partly for devil's advocate, saying, hey, let's clearly articulate what it really brings us, right?
I would really love to somebody technical from the F5 that wanted to propose Nginx and or actually implement and publish that and work with me. Just take a look at the repository that I shared. If it makes sense to create exactly the same repository, but with Nginx, with the same structure, like give me a feedback a little bit on the technical side.
Yeah, I'll be taking a look at these links,
And then we
try
can
to
work
figure out.
together on creating whether we're doing exactly the same or we're changing it, what the gaps
Well, yeah,
are.
so we also had some more advanced proposals. Maybe it makes sense to skip the first one and move to, GLB or one of the more hardcore, second things. We'll figure it out. But I need some time to absorb what you've got and see what it has, and maybe circle back with my folks and figure out, what we want to do. Unfortunately, I'm out of time, so I'm going to be dropping soon.
Yeah, we're all out of time. So we'll pick up the general discussion of this point tomorrow in the TSC. I personally think this is worth pursuing, but again, we'll sort of continue this discussion because it's an important one tomorrow. And I think at a minimum, it's a good exercise for having additional groups understand, whether things fit into OPI correctly or not. So
Is there a recipe for onboarding applications?
that's right. Recipe.
Can we
That's a
follow
great
it?
thing to say, Tim. In fact, yeah, you could kick us off, Tim, with kind of a summary of this discussion, and we can then, open it up and go from there.
All right. I want to thank everyone for their engagement today, and thanks for working with us, Boris. We appreciate it.
Thank you, and sorry for being negative.
Yeah.
Sounding negative.
Worked with you
It's
enough.
hard to question things, right? That's the
Yeah,
sort of goal of being in a field that's science-based.
Yeah, exactly. The devil's advocate position is good. And again, the discussion helps illuminate what we really should and shouldn't do. So let's, like I say, Tim, please summarize this tomorrow. I'll put this on the agenda when I create it this afternoon, and this is good.
All right. Talk to you tomorrow, Joe.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.